The rope felt alive in Caleb's hands. He stood in the master bedroom of Thornley House, 10 feet from the four-poster bed where Silas Thornley lay sleeping, and studied the braided hemp as though it were scripture. 23 years he'd been dressing this man, shaving his jowls, polishing his boots, standing invisible at his shoulder while Silas conducted the business of cotton and human flesh. Tonight, that invisibility would serve a different master. August in Alabama was a living hell. The heat pressed against the windows like something solid, something with weight and malice. Caleb's shirt clung to his back beneath his house livery, the fine gray wool jacket Constance insisted he wear even in summer, because appearances mattered in the Thornley household. Silas snored, the wet rattle of a man who drank too much port and ate too much pork. His nightshirt had fallen open at the collar, exposing the soft white flesh of his throat. Caleb stared at that throat and remembered other throats, dark ones, collared with iron, stretched taut with screaming. He moved to the chandelier. The room smelled of bay rum and stale cigar smoke, of chamber pot and expensive cologne. Constance kept fresh magnolias on the dresser, wilting now in the heat. But underneath the perfume lay the true scent of Thornley House, fear, sweat and old blood soaked into the floorboards. Caleb's hands didn't shake. 23 years of serving breakfast on fine china, of tying cravats with perfect knots, his hands had learned steadiness through repetition and pain. The chandelier was crystal, imported from France, worth more than every soul in the quarters combined. Caleb knew its weight, its balance point, had cleaned it 100 times. He knew it would hold. He climbed onto Silas's reading chair and looped the rope through the center fixture, testing the knot with gentle pressure. The chandelier swayed slightly, crystals tinkling like tiny bells. Caleb froze. Silas snorted, turned his head, and fell deeper into sleep. The clock on the mantel said midnight. In 6 hours, Constance would ring for her morning chocolate. In 6 hours, the house would wake to screaming. He stepped down and approached the bed, rope trailing behind him like a serpent. This close, he could see the broken capillaries across Silas's cheeks, and could smell the sour reek of digestion. This close, he could kill him quickly. But that wasn't the plan. The plan required precision, required it to look natural. Slaves who murdered their masters died slowly, publicly, in ways designed to terrify every other slave into absolute obedience. And Caleb had no intention of dying. Not until the work was finished. He pulled the small brown bottle from his pocket. Laudanum, from Constance's medicine cabinet. He'd been watering it down for weeks, replacing the missing liquid bit by bit. The bottle's mouth pressed against Silas's lips. Caleb tilted the sleeping man's head back the way he did every morning for shaving, and poured. Silas sputtered, swallowed reflexively, coughed. His eyes fluttered but didn't open. "For Dinah," Caleb whispered. The first words he'd spoken in 3 days. 3 nights ago, Dinah had dropped a tea service, good china, a wedding present. Constance's face had gone red, then white. Silas had stood slowly, setting down his newspaper with deliberate calm. "Clumsy," he'd said. Just that one word. "Clumsy slaves go south," Silas had continued. "To the cotton fields. Or to Louisiana." Dinah had trembled, backing away. "I'm sorry, Master Silas, my hands just. God has nothing to do with what happens in my house. Jarrett, make the arrangements. I want her on a wagon by tomorrow." That night, Caleb had held Dinah in their cabin behind the kitchen. She hadn't cried. She'd stopped crying years ago. She'd just pressed her face against his chest and breathed. "Tell me a story," she'd said. "Tell me about the ocean." The next morning, Jarrett Holcomb had come for her. She'd walked with her head high, and hadn't looked back. But at the end of the lane, everyone in the quarters had heard her scream. One scream, torn from somewhere so deep it might have been her soul escaping, making its run for freedom before the flesh could be sold. Caleb blinked and was back in the bedroom. Silas's breathing had deepened, becoming labored. The drug was taking hold. He worked quickly now, fashioning a slipknot noose and easing it around Silas's neck. The man's flesh was soft as a woman's, unmarked by sun or labor. Caleb's own neck bore the faint white scars of a collar he'd worn as a child. He got Silas upright, got him standing, the rope now taut between neck and chandelier. This was the moment. This was the threshold. Caleb stepped back, and gravity did the rest. The rope snapped taut with a sound like a cracking whip. Silas's body dropped 8 inches and stopped, suspended, swaying. His legs kicked, involuntary, already dying, and one foot struck the bedpost. The chandelier groaned, crystals chattering their alarm. Caleb watched. Silas's face purpled in the moonlight. His tongue protruded slightly, obscene and childlike. The whole thing took 4 minutes. When it was finished, Caleb moved with the efficiency of routine. He returned the reading chair to its proper position. He collected the laudanum bottle. He disturbed the bed sheets just so, making it look as though Silas had risen in the night, perhaps drunk or sleepwalking. He positioned Constance's vanity chair beneath the chandelier at an angle, suggesting it had been kicked away. Then he looked at his work. Silas Thornley swayed gently in the hot breeze, suspended between earth and heaven, too heavy for one and too corrupt for the other. His hands hung limp at his sides, hands that had signed bills of sale, that had pointed to who would be whipped and who would be sold away from their children. First, Caleb said quietly, of many. He extinguished his candle and darkness became complete. He exited through the servants' passage, the narrow stairs built into the walls so slaves could move through the house without contaminating the family's sight lines. In the kitchen pantry, he returned the rope where he'd taken it, coiled among the others used for hanging smoked meat. Rope was rope. No one would question it. He cleaned his hands in the wash basin and smoothed his jacket. His reflection showed nothing, a face that had learned neutrality the way a preacher learns scripture. 47 years old and he'd been property for 43 of them. His earliest memory was of his mother's hands being torn from his, of being lifted onto a wagon while she screamed his name. Now he had added Silas's silence to his collection. Above, the stars wheeled in their courses, indifferent. From the quarters came the sound of crying, someone's baby, or someone mourning something too fresh to bear silently. Caleb entered his small room off the main house and lay on his cot. Before sleep took him, he thought of Dinah one last time, trying to remember her smile. 1 down, he thought. 5 to go. Dawn came too early. Caleb was already awake when the first scream tore through Thornley House. Margaret, Constance's lady's maid, a thin girl of 19, had found the body. Her scream was primal, wordless. The sound of someone who'd seen hell. Caleb stood, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the house. The kitchen was chaotic. Essie the cook stood frozen at the hearth, wooden spoon in hand. Other slaves appeared from their posts, drawn by catastrophe. Constance emerged from her bedroom in her nightgown and robe, hair in curling papers. What is the meaning of this disturbance? Margaret stumbled out of the master bedroom, hands clutching at her own throat, unable to speak. Constance pushed past her. Then Constance screamed too, controlled, performative, but underneath, genuine shock. Jarrett Holcomb thundered up the stairs, pistol in hand. The overseer was 6'3" and built like a prize bull, with small mean eyes. He'd been overseer at Thornley for a decade, earning his position through efficiency and creative cruelty. Mrs. Thornley. Ma'am, what's happened? He entered the bedroom and stopped dead. Christ Almighty. Montgomery appeared, 24 and already showing his father's dissipation. Louisa, 16 with blonde curls loose. Young Tobias, only 12, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Montgomery reached the doorway, looked inside, and vomited onto the hall runner. Jarrett emerged, hand on his pistol. Everyone stay exactly where you are. Nobody moves until I say so. What happened? Montgomery managed. Looks like Master Silas took his own life. Hanged himself from the bedroom chandelier. The words fell like stones. Constance found her voice, that's impossible. Silas would never. No mistake, ma'am. There's a chair kicked over, and the way the rope is tied. Constance began issuing orders, fetch the doctor, send for the reverend. Montgomery steeled himself and entered the bedroom to see his father. Caleb stood at the back of the crowd, his face carefully arranged into shock and sorrow. He let his eyes go slightly wet, let them see what they expected, a loyal servant grieving his master. Louisa stood frozen in the hallway, tears streaming. She looked up and her eyes met Caleb's. For a moment, just a moment, something passed between them. A question in her gaze, unformed but present. He would need to be more careful with her. Caleb, Constance called. I'll require coffee. Yes, ma'am. Right away, ma'am. In the kitchen, Essie and Pearl waited for news, faces tight with fear. They knew that when white folks died, black folks paid the price. Is it true? Essie whispered. Master Silas is dead. Hanged himself, looks like. As he made coffee, Pearl appeared at his elbow. We heard her, she whispered, barely audible. 3 nights ago. We all heard Miss Dinah screaming. We know what that scream meant. Caleb's heart stuttered. We know, Pearl said again. And we won't say anything. Not to them. Not ever. She melted back into the group. The invisible people of Thornley Plantation saw more than the masters knew. The morning wore on. The doctor pronounced it suicide. The Reverend prayed. Neighbors arrived to offer condolences. Through it all, Caleb served coffee and kept his face neutral as a mask. By evening, the story was set. Silas Thornley, overcome by unknown despair, had taken his own life. And in his small room, Caleb lay on his cot and thought about rope. For more lengths of it. For more necks. Outside, someone in the quarters sang about crossing over Jordan, about laying down their burdens, about home at last. Tomorrow, he would begin planning the second death. Tonight, he would remember Dinah's face and convince himself this was what love looked like, when love had nowhere else to go. If you're enjoying this descent into darkness, subscribe to stay with us through every twisted tale. Drop a comment below. Do you think justice can be born from vengeance? 3 days of mourning had turned Thornley House into a mausoleum. Black crape hung from every window, suffocating what little breeze managed to penetrate the August heat. The mirrors were covered, the clock stopped at the hour of Silas's discovery, and Constance Thornley moved through the halls like a queen in exile, her black bombazine dress rustling with each calculated step. Caleb watched her from the shadows of the dining room as she reviewed household accounts with Montgomery. She hadn't shed a tear since that first performative scream. Now she was all business, her grief measured in ledger lines and property assessments. The funeral is tomorrow, she said, her voice crisp. After that, we'll need to address the matter of succession. The plantation won't run itself. Montgomery looked haggard, his eyes red-rimmed from genuine grief or guilty drinking. Caleb couldn't tell which. Mother, father's barely cold. Can't we? Your father is dead, Montgomery. Dead men don't pay debts or manage crops. Constance's finger traced a column of figures. We have 63 slaves, 200 acres under cultivation, and creditors in Mobile who won't wait for our tears to dry. You're the master of Thornley now. Act like it. Caleb refilled their coffee cups with steady hands, a ghost moving through their conversation. Neither acknowledged him. To them, he was part of the furniture, as permanent and unremarkable as the wallpaper. That was their first mistake. Jarrett Holcomb arrived as the grandfather clock, wound again, life resuming its rhythm, struck 4. The overseer's boots tracked red clay across Constance's Persian rug, but she didn't chastise him. She needed Jarrett now, needed his brutality to keep order while the family's authority wavered. Any news from the quarters? Constance asked without preamble. Nothing unusual, ma'am. Everyone's working, no trouble. Jarrett's small eyes flickered to Caleb, then away. Though I don't like it. Too quiet. Slaves get ideas when the master dies. Then make sure they understand that nothing has changed, Constance said coldly. The hand that feeds them may have changed, but the whip remains the same. Yes, ma'am. Jarrett shifted his weight. There's something else. Been thinking about Master Silas's death. Something doesn't sit right. Montgomery looked up sharply. The doctor said suicide. What more is there? Maybe nothing. But I've seen men hang themselves before, saw a field hand do it 2 plantations over, 5 years back. This felt different. Too neat. Too arranged. Caleb's pulse quickened, but his face remained impassive. He moved to the sideboard, rearranging dishes that didn't need rearranging, every movement deliberate and unhurried. Are you suggesting foul play? Constance's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. I'm suggesting we keep our eyes open, ma'am. Watch the house slaves especially. They got access, got knowledge of the house. Jarrett's gaze found Caleb again, lingering. Some of them are smart enough to be dangerous. Caleb has been with us for 23 years, Constance said, though her tone carried a note of uncertainty. He was devoted to Silas. Maybe. Or maybe something changed. Jarrett pulled a flask from his coat and took a long drink, unbidden. Just saying we should be careful. Lock our doors at night. Keep weapons close. Montgomery laughed, sharp and bitter. You think one of our own servants killed father? That's absurd. They wouldn't dare. But his eyes, when they finally landed on Caleb, held a flicker of doubt. Will there be anything else? Caleb asked, his voice the perfect pitch of deference. No, Constance said. You're dismissed. Caleb bowed slightly and retreated to the kitchen, but he'd heard enough. Jarrett suspected something. Not enough to act on, not yet, but enough to make the overseer dangerous. The second death would need to happen soon, before suspicion hardened into certainty. That night, Montgomery Thornley sat alone in his father's study, his study now, and worked his way through a bottle of French brandy that had cost more than a field hand's yearly value. The room still smelled of Silas, tobacco and leather and the particular sourness of old money. Montgomery had avoided it since the funeral, had avoided thinking about the weight now pressing on his shoulders. Master of Thornley. What did that even mean? He'd spent his life preparing for it and now felt utterly unprepared. He poured another glass with shaking hands. The house creaked around him, settling into the night. Every sound made him jump. Every shadow seemed to hold judgment. He couldn't shake the image of his father's purple face, tongue protruding, eyes bulging with whatever final terror had gripped him. Had father known? In those last moments, had he understood what he was doing? Montgomery's own thoughts grew dark and slippery. The plantation was drowning in debt. The cotton market was unstable. The slaves, God, the slaves outnumbered the family 10-1. What if Jarrett was right? What if they were planning something? His hand found the pistol in the desk drawer. The metal was cool, reassuring. A soft knock at the door made him drop the glass. Brandy spilled across the desk blotter, soaking into his father's unfinished correspondence. Master Montgomery. Caleb's voice, gentle and concerned. I saw the light burning. I thought you might want coffee. I want to be left alone, Montgomery slurred, but even as he said it, he felt grateful for human presence. The darkness beyond the study windows pressed too close, too full of watching eyes. Of course, sir. I'll just leave the tray. Caleb entered, a silver service balanced perfectly in his hands. He set it on the side table with practiced grace, then moved to clean the spilled brandy. Leave it, Montgomery said. Then, softer, did father ever talk to you? About his worries? His fears? Caleb paused, cloth in hand. For a moment, something flickered across his face, something Montgomery was too drunk to read. Master Silas kept his own counsel, sir. He wasn't one to share burdens with his servants. No. No, he wouldn't be. Montgomery reached for the coffee, found his hands shaking too badly, and opted for more brandy instead. I don't know how to do this, Caleb. I don't know how to be him. Perhaps you're not meant to be him, sir. Perhaps you're meant to be yourself. The words hung in the air, strange and seditious. Montgomery looked at Caleb, really looked at him, for perhaps the first time in years. When did the valet get so old? When had those lines appeared around his eyes, that gray threaded through his hair? 23 years of service. 23 years of standing silent in corners, anticipating needs, existing in the negative space of white people's lives. Did you ever hate him? Montgomery asked suddenly. My father. Did you ever hate him for what he was? Caleb's face became a mask. I'm sure I don't know what you mean, sir. Don't you? Montgomery leaned forward, brandy making him reckless. He owned you. Owned your wife. Sold her away like she was livestock. Did you ever hate him for that? The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. The clock ticked. The house creaked. And Caleb stood perfectly still, the coffee pot gleaming in his dark hands. A slave who hates his master doesn't survive long, Master Montgomery. We learn to feel nothing. It's safer that way. Nothing, Montgomery repeated. God, what kind of life is that? The only kind we're allowed, sir. Montgomery wanted to say something, an apology, maybe, or a justification, or a promise that things would be different under his rule. But the words turned to ash in his mouth. What could he say? What could any of them say that would unmake centuries of cruelty? He reached for his coffee instead, the cup Caleb had poured. The liquid was dark and fragrant, cut with cream and sugar exactly the way he liked it. Caleb always remembered. Caleb remembered everything. Thank you, Montgomery said quietly. You can go. Caleb bowed and left, closing the door with a soft click. Montgomery drank the coffee. It was excellent, as always. Caleb's coffee was always excellent. The warmth spread through his chest, mixing with the brandy already churning in his stomach. He suddenly felt terribly tired. The kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from grief and guilt and too much thinking. His eyelids grew heavy. The study blurred at the edges. The last thing Montgomery Thornley thought before the laudanum pulled him under was that he should have locked the door. He should have listened to Jarrett. He should have been afraid. Caleb waited 30 minutes before he returned to the study. The house slept around him, 63 souls in the quarters and 6 in the main house, all dreaming whatever dreams the oppressed and the oppressors dreamed. Only Caleb moved through the darkness, a shadow among shadows. Montgomery had slumped forward across the desk, cheek pressed against his father's ruined letters, drool pooling at the corner of his mouth. His breathing was deep and labored, the rasp of a body fighting poison it couldn't name. Caleb stood over him for a long moment, rope coiled in his hands. I did hate him, he said softly. I hated him with everything I am. And I hate you too, though you're too weak to deserve it. Montgomery's eyes fluttered open, just barely, just enough to see Caleb looming above him, just enough for recognition to dawn in his drug-addled mind. Their eyes met, and for the first time in Montgomery's life, he truly saw his servant. Saw the man behind the mask. Saw the rage and grief and terrible patience that had sustained Caleb through 23 years of bondage. Montgomery tried to speak, but his tongue was thick, useless. Caleb slipped the noose over his head with practiced ease. Your father asked if I ever hated him. You asked too. Here's your answer. He threw the rope over the study's oak beam, the same beam Silas had installed to support his trophy deer heads, and pulled. Montgomery's chair scraped backward as his body rose. He clawed at the rope with sluggish hands, feet kicking weakly at empty air. The beam groaned but held. It had been built to hold weight. Caleb secured the rope to the desk leg and stepped back. This death was messier than Silas's. Montgomery fought the drug and the noose, his body jerking in horrible spasms, his face cycling through shades of red and purple. His eyes never left Caleb's, bulging with terror and betrayal and something that might have been understanding. It took longer. 6 minutes this time. When it was done, Caleb arranged the scene. He scattered papers across the desk, bills of sale, debt notices, foreclosure warnings he'd found in Silas's correspondence. He tipped over the brandy bottle, letting it glug out across the floor. He positioned Montgomery's hand near a sheet that read simply, I cannot bear the burden. A suicide note, of sorts. The weight of inheritance crushing a weak man. Caleb stood in the doorway and surveyed his work. Montgomery Thornley swung gently from the oak beam, his fine silk cravat askew, his expensive boots pointing toward a hell he probably didn't believe in. 2 down. 4 to go. The screams came at dawn, as Caleb knew they would. This time it was young Tobias who found the body, looking for his brother, finding instead a corpse. The boy's shrieks were raw and primal, the sound of innocence dying. Caleb was in the kitchen when the household erupted. He'd timed it perfectly, far enough away to have an alibi, close enough to respond quickly. Constance's voice cut through the chaos like a blade, not again. God help us, not again. By the time Caleb reached the study, Jarrett was already there, pistol drawn, rage and fear warring on his brutal face. Constance stood rigid as iron, her hand pressed to her mouth. Louisa had fainted in the hallway. And Tobias, poor Tobias, sat on the floor, rocking back and forth, whimpering. Cut him down, Constance ordered, her voice barely controlled. And send for Sheriff Pruitt. Now. Jarrett's eyes found Caleb in the doorway. Where were you? Where were you last night? In my quarters, sir. Sleeping. Can anyone verify that? I sleep alone, sir. Since my wife was sold. The words landed like bullets. Jarrett's jaw tightened, but he had no response. As they cut Montgomery down, as Constance herded her remaining children away from horror, as the plantation descended into chaos once more, Caleb felt eyes on him. Louisa, revived and pale, stood at the far end of the hallway. Her gaze was fixed on him with terrible clarity, and in her eyes he saw the question forming, sharpening, taking shape. Is it you? He didn't answer. Didn't need to. But she knew. Somewhere deep in her 16-year-old bones, she knew. The hunt had been noticed. Now the real danger began. Before we continue down this blood-soaked path, hit that subscribe button if you crave more macabre tales. Comment your thoughts. How far would you go for freedom? Sheriff Ezekiel Pruitt arrived at noon, his horse lathered and his face grim beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He was a lean man in his 50s, hard as hickory, with eyes that had seen too much of humanity's darkness to be easily fooled. He'd kept the peace in Jefferson County for 15 years through a combination of brutal efficiency and willful blindness to what happened on plantations behind closed doors. But 2 deaths in 3 days demanded attention, even from a man practiced in looking away. Caleb served whiskey in the parlor while Constance recounted the discovery. Her voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her glass. Jarrett stood by the window, pistol prominent at his hip, watching the quarters with naked suspicion. 2 suicides, Sheriff Pruitt said slowly, rolling the word around his mouth like tobacco. In the same family. In the same week. My husband was troubled, Constance said. And my son. Montgomery took his father's death hard. Too hard, it seems. That's what it looks like, ma'am. That's exactly what it looks like. Pruitt's gaze flickered to Caleb, then away. Which is why it troubles me. Meaning? Constance's spine straightened. Meaning it's convenient. Meaning I've seen staged scenes before, and both these deaths are mighty tidy for men who supposedly killed themselves in despair. He set down his glass and stood. I'd like to question your household. Starting with the slaves who had access to both men. Jarrett's expression turned predatory. About time. I've been saying since the first death. You'll say nothing unless I ask you, Pruitt interrupted. This is a legal matter now, Holcomb. You'll do well to remember that. For the next 3 hours, Sheriff Pruitt interviewed the household. Caleb watched from his position by the sideboard as, one by one, house slaves were brought before the sheriff, Margaret the lady's maid, Rachel the upstairs chambermaid, Thomas the footman, old Samuel who tended fires. Each told the same story, nothing unusual, no disturbances, no signs of foul play. They'd learned long ago that the less they saw, the longer they survived. When Caleb's turn came, he stood before Pruitt with perfect posture and downcast eyes. You're the valet, Pruitt said. You were close to both deceased men. I served them faithfully, sir. That's not what I asked. You were close to them. You knew their habits, their moods, their movements. Yes, sir. It was my duty to anticipate their needs. Pruitt leaned back, studying Caleb with uncomfortable intensity. You've been here 23 years. That's a long time to serve the same family. Must build up a powerful knowledge of their secrets. Caleb kept his face neutral. I know only what I need to serve properly, sir. Is that right? Pruitt pulled out a small notebook. Your wife was sold 3 days before Silas Thornley died. That's what the records show. Sold to a broker heading to Louisiana. That must have been hard for you. The silence stretched. In the corner, Constance shifted uncomfortably. Jarrett's hand drifted toward his pistol. Hard or not, sir, it's not my place to question the master's decisions. I'm property, same as she was. Property doesn't have feelings about being separated from other property. You really believe that? I have to believe it, sir. Anything else would be dangerous. Pruitt stared at him for a long moment, then made a note in his book. Where were you the night both men died? In my quarters, sir. Sleeping. Alone. Convenient that you sleep alone. No one to verify your whereabouts. I've slept alone since my wife was sold, sir. Not by my choice, but by circumstance. Another note. Another long stare. Then Pruitt waved him away. You can go. As Caleb left the parlor, he heard Pruitt say to Constance, I don't like him. Too smart. Too calm. Slaves that are educated are trouble waiting to happen. Caleb is loyal, Constance protested, though her voice carried doubt. Loyal until they're not, ma'am. I've seen it before. Quiet ones are the worst, they're the ones planning while the loud ones are just talking. That evening, Louisa Thornley found Caleb in the hallway outside her room. She'd been watching him all day, he realized. Following his movements with her eyes, cataloging his presence in doorways, on staircases, in corners where he shouldn't be. Where he'd always been, invisible until now. Caleb, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned, his expression perfectly neutral. Miss Louisa. Do you require something? The truth. She stepped closer, and he could see the fear in her blue eyes, warring with something else, curiosity, maybe, or a desperate need to understand. Is it you? Are you doing this? I don't know what you mean, miss. Don't lie to me. Please. Her voice cracked. Father, and now Montgomery, and you're always there. Always watching. I see you watching. Caleb could have denied it. Could have played the perfect servant, could have gaslit her into doubting her own perceptions the way white people had been doing to slaves since the first chains were forged. Instead, he simply looked at her. Really looked at her, the way he'd looked at Montgomery in that final moment of recognition. Let her see past the mask to the man underneath, to the rage and grief and terrible purpose that animated him. Louisa's breath caught. She backed against the wall, hand pressed to her chest. You're going to kill us all, she whispered. Aren't you? Not all of you, miss. Just the ones who deserve it. And who decides that? You. Someone has to. His voice remained soft, conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. Your father sold my wife to a man who works women to death in cane fields. Your brother watched it happen and did nothing. Your mother suggested it as punishment for a broken teapot. Who else should judge them, if not the ones they've wronged? Then why not kill me too? I was there. I saw it happen and said nothing. You're 16. A child by law, if not by conscience. Caleb's eyes were ancient, merciless. But if you warn them, if you tell your mother or Jarrett or that sheriff what you suspect, then you won't be innocent anymore. Do you understand? Louisa trembled but held his gaze. What about Tobias? He's just 12. Children are safe. For now. Caleb took a step closer, and Louisa pressed harder against the wall. But silence is the price of that safety. Say nothing. See nothing. Be as blind to my work as I was expected to be blind to yours. I could scream right now. Jarrett's downstairs. He'd come running. You could, Caleb agreed. And what would you tell him? That you suspect the loyal valet based on nothing but a feeling? They'd think you hysterical with grief. Women often are, aren't they? That's what they'd say. Louisa's jaw tightened. She knew he was right. Her testimony would be dismissed as feminine weakness, as the vapors that afflicted delicate young ladies in times of stress. How many more? She asked finally. As many as justice requires. This isn't justice. It's murder. Murder is what your family has done for generations, Miss Louisa. This is just the bill coming due. Caleb stepped back, gave a slight bow. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have evening duties to attend to. Do sleep well. Lock your door if it makes you feel safer. Though locks have never stopped me before. He walked away down the hall, leaving Louisa shaking against the wall, caught between horror and a terrible understanding. She could warn her family. She could tell them everything. But something, guilt, maybe, or a bone-deep recognition that the world was more complex than her parents had taught her, kept her silent. Caleb heard her door close, heard the lock turn. It wouldn't matter. Louisa wasn't on his list. Not yet, anyway. That night, Bartholomew Ashford, Constance's brother, sat in the guest room reading shipping manifests by candlelight. He'd planned to leave 2 days ago, but Constance had begged him to stay. She needed family, needed support, needed someone who wasn't paralyzed by grief or suspicion. Bartholomew was a merchant, practical and unsentimental. He'd built his fortune importing goods from Europe and exporting cotton, and he had no patience for Southern Gothic melodrama. 2 suicides were tragic but not mysterious. The Thornley men had always been weak, prone to melancholy and drink. He was just grateful it wasn't contagious. A soft knock at his door pulled him from his calculations. Yes. Mr. Ashford, sir. I've brought fresh linens. Caleb's voice, deferential as always. Just leave them by the door. Begging your pardon, sir, but Mrs. Thornley insists on proper turn-down service. She says standards must be maintained, even in grief. Bartholomew sighed. Constance and her endless standards. Fine. Come in. Caleb entered carrying folded sheets, moving with that peculiar grace all good servants possessed, the ability to be present without imposing, to serve without intruding. He began changing the bed linens with practiced efficiency. Terrible business, Bartholomew said, not really expecting a response. This family seems cursed. Perhaps, sir. You don't believe in curses? I believe we make our own curses, sir. Through our choices and actions. Caleb smoothed the top sheet with careful hands. The past has a way of demanding payment. Bartholomew looked up from his manifests, suddenly uneasy. There was something in the valet's tone, something that didn't quite match his words. You sound like a preacher. I've heard many sermons, sir. One learns theology by proximity, even if one isn't allowed in the church proper. I suppose that's true. Bartholomew returned to his papers, already dismissing the conversation. Slaves said odd things sometimes, it was best not to encourage it. You can go. I'll manage the rest myself. Of course, sir. But first. Caleb crossed to the window, ostensibly to draw the curtains. Do you remember a man named Josiah? Field hand, 12 years ago. You visited the plantation then. Bartholomew frowned. I don't keep track of every slave I've seen. No, sir. But you might remember this one. He stole bread from the kitchen. Half a loaf. His children were hungry. Caleb's voice remained conversational, pleasant even. You suggested branding him. On the face, you said. So everyone would know he was a thief. The memory surfaced slowly, a hot afternoon, a muscular slave held down by 3 others, the smell of burning flesh. Bartholomew had forgotten about it within a week. Just another day maintaining order. That was necessary, he said defensively. Theft can't be tolerated. No, sir. It can't. Caleb turned from the window, and in his hands was a rope. Neither can cruelty. Bartholomew opened his mouth to shout, but Caleb was faster. The rope looped around his neck, pulled tight. Bartholomew was 53, soft from years of good living. He fought, clawing at the hemp, kicking over his chair, sending manifests flying. But Caleb was stronger. Years of hauling trunks, lifting furniture, carrying the weight of servitude had made him iron hard. He pulled Bartholomew backward, away from the door, away from help. This death was Messier. Bartholomew thrashed and fought, his face cycling through red, purple, black. His fingernails tore at Caleb's hands, drawing blood. His heels drummed against the floor hard enough to wake the dead. Caleb held on. 8 minutes this time. The longest yet. When Bartholomew finally went limp, Caleb let him drop and stood there, breathing hard, blood dripping from the scratches on his hands. This hadn't gone as planned. Too much noise. Too much struggle. He needed to be more careful. He hoisted Bartholomew's body onto the bed, then looped the rope over the four-poster's canopy frame. Made it look like the merchant had hanged himself from his own bed, overcome perhaps by witnessing his nephew's deaths. Before leaving, Caleb tore a piece of fabric from his own sleeve and tucked it under the bed, obvious enough to be found, generic enough to belong to any of the house slaves. A red herring. Let them chase shadows while he finished his work. He slipped out through the servants' passage, leaving chaos behind. 3 down. 3 to go. The walls of Thornley House had ears now, and they were listening to screams. Constance Thornley stood in the grand ballway at dawn, surrounded by corpses of her life. 3 men died in 6 days. Her husband. Her eldest son. Her brother. The mathematics of loss calculated themselves in her mind with ruthless precision: 3 funerals, 3 coffins, 3 plots in the family cemetery. 3 reasons to be afraid. Sheriff Pruitt had returned with 2 deputies, their boots tracking mud across her floors. They'd found the torn fabric under Bartholomew's bed, coarse grey wool, the kind issued to house slaves. They'd interviewed everyone again, their questions sharper now, their suspicions crystallizing into accusations. Jarrett wanted to burn the quarters. Wanted to line up every slave and whip confessions from their backs until someone broke, someone talked, someone paid. Constance had forbidden it, barely. Not from mercy, but from pragmatism. You couldn't harvest cotton with dead or crippled slaves, and the crop was 2 months from picking. But her pragmatism was cracking under the weight of terror. "We're locking the family into separate rooms tonight," Jarrett announced, standing before the parlor fireplace like a general planning war. "Armed guards outside each door. No one enters or leaves until morning." "That's a prison," Louisa said quietly from her chair by the window. She'd barely spoken since Montgomery's death, had retreated into some private space of horror and understanding. "You're making us prisoners in our own home." "Better prisoners than corpses," Jarrett snapped. "Mrs. Thornley, with respect, we need to take stronger measures. Lock the slaves in the quarters at night. Post armed men around the house. Search every cabin for rope, for weapons, for anything that might." "Do it," Constance interrupted. Her voice was iron, but her hands shook as she lifted her tea. "Do whatever you must. I want this family protected." Caleb stood against the wall, silver coffee pot in hand, and listened. They were adapting, learning fear. That would make the next death harder, but not impossible. Fear makes people stupid. Made them focus on the wrong threats while the real danger stood right beside them, waiting to refill their cups. "What about the valet?" Pruitt asked, his eyes finding Caleb. "He has keys to everything. Sleep in the house. Has access we can't control." "Caleb has been with us for 23 years, Constance said, though her voice carried less certainty than before. "He's been loyal." "Loyal slaves don't exist, ma'am. Just ones who haven't found their opportunity yet." Pruitt stood, adjusted his gun belt. "I want him locked in his quarters at night too. No exceptions." "I need him," Constance protested. "Who'll tend the fires, serve breakfast, manage the household?" "Ma'am, with respect, you need to be alive more than you need fresh coffee." The words hung in the air. Constance's facade cracked slightly, and for just a moment, Caleb saw raw terror in her eyes. She was 52 years old and had never known fear, real fear, the kind that came from powerlessness, from understanding that violence could reach you regardless of wealth or status. Now she knows. Now she was learning what her slaves had known their entire lives. "Very well," she said finally. "Lock him in. Lock everyone in. Just, make this stop." Caleb bowed slightly. "As you wish, ma'am. Shall I prepare the evening meal before I'm confined?" "Yes." "And Caleb?" Constance looked at him fully for the first time in years, really looked at him. "If you know anything, anything at all about what's happening, I'm asking you to tell me. Please." Their eyes met. In that moment, recognition passed between them, the mistress and the slave, the oppressor and the oppressed, 2 human beings connected by chains of their own making. Caleb could have confessed. Could have told her everything, about Dinah's screams, about the rope, about justice and vengeance and the long patience of the damned. Could have given her the truth she was begging for. Instead, he simply said, "I know nothing, ma'am. I'm just a servant." The lie tasted like freedom. That night, they locked Caleb in his small room off the kitchen. Jarrett himself turned the key, his face triumphant and suspicious in equal measure. "You stay put until morning," the overseer growled through the door. "Try anything and I'll shoot you dead, loyal or not." Caleb listened to the footsteps retreat, heard the guards being posted, heard the elaborate security measures being implemented throughout Thornley House. Locks clicking. Furniture being moved to barricade doors. Whispered prayers from Constance's room, begging God for protection from whatever demon had invaded her home. He waited 2 hours, until the house settled into uneasy silence. Then he pulled the spare key from where he'd hidden it, tucked into a crack in the floorboards beneath his cot, and unlocked his door from the inside. Jarrett had forgotten, in his certainty of authority, that a valet holds keys to everything. Forgets nothing. Plans for every contingency. That was their second mistake. Caleb moved through the darkness like smoke. He knew which floorboards creaked, which doors squeaked, which shadows offered concealment. 23 years of invisible servitude had mapped this house into his bones. He passed the guard posted at the foot of the main stairs. The man was asleep, head lolled back against the wall, rifle loose in his lap. Caleb could have killed him. Could have snapped his neck and moved on. But the guard was just a hired man from town, not complicit in the family's crimes. Not everyone deserved death. Just the ones who'd earned it. He climbed the servants' passage to the second floor. Paused outside Constance's bedroom door, listening. She was awake inside, pacing. He could hear the rustle of her nightgown, the soft sobs she thought no one could hear. She was alone. Vulnerable. It would be so easy to end it now, slip inside, silence her before she could scream, hang her from her own chandelier and be done. But Caleb had learned patience. Had learned that the best revenge wasn't quick, wasn't merciful. The best revenge was making them understand, making them feel every moment of the terror they'd inflicted on others. He wanted Constance to suffer first. Wanted her to lose everything before she lost her life. Instead, he moved past her door and descended to the library. Found paper and ink. Wrote in careful, educated script, the handwriting he'd been taught by Silas's father, back when it was still legal to teach slaves to read. You sold my wife to hell and called it commerce. You broke my heart and called it management. Now I'm breaking yours, piece by piece, and calling it justice. Sleep well, Mrs. Thornley. Or try to. He left the note on Silas's desk where she'd find it in the morning. Then he began his real work. He moved through the house like a ghost, doing nothing violent, nothing criminal. Just, unsettling things. Moving objects. Leaving coils of rope on doorsteps. Creating the sounds of footsteps in empty hallways, of breathing behind locked doors. He stood outside Tobias's room and softly, so softly, scratched at the door. Heard the boy wake with a gasp, heard him cry out for his mother. Heard Constance rush to comfort him, her voice shrill with fear. He went to Montgomery's study, still unstained despite attempts to scrub it clean, and swung the chandelier slightly, making the crystals chime like funeral bells. The sound echoed through the house, waking everyone. He crept to the guest room where Bartholomew had died and opened the window, letting the August wind howl through the halls like the voices of the dead. By 3 in the morning, Thornley House was in chaos. Guards fired at shadows. Louisa screamed about seeing figures in corners. Tobias sobbed into Constance's nightgown. Jarrett raged through the hallways, pistol drawn, shooting at nothing. And Caleb watched from the servants' passage, invisible as he'd always been, as terror consumed the family from within. He didn't kill anyone that night. I didn't need to. Sometimes the threat of death was more powerful than death itself. At dawn, Jarrett unlocked Caleb's door and found him lying peacefully on his cot, apparently undisturbed by the night's chaos. Did you hear all the commotion? Jarrett demanded. Yes, sir. Quite frightening. I prayed for the family's safety. Your door was locked all night. Yes, sir. You locked it yourself. Jarrett wanted to argue, wanted to accuse, but he had no evidence. The lock had been secure when he checked it. The door hadn't been forced. And Caleb looked exactly as he should, calm, concerned, perfectly innocent. Get to the kitchen, Jarrett finally growled. Mrs. Thornley wants coffee. Of course, sir. In the kitchen, Essie and Pearl were already preparing breakfast, their movements quick and nervous. They'd heard the shots, the screaming, the sound of the house tearing itself apart. What happened? Pearl whispered as Caleb passed. Justice, he said quietly. Slow and patient as the Lord himself. Pearl's eyes widened, but she said nothing. In the quarters, they were all whispering now, had been since Silas died. Connecting pieces, understanding patterns. The invisible people saw everything, and what they saw was rebellion written in rope and shadow. Some were terrified. Some were exhilarated. All were silent. When Caleb brought coffee to the dining room, he found the family assembled, Constance haggard and hollow-eyed, Louisa pale as death, young Tobias clinging to his mother's arm. Jarrett stood guard, rifle in hand, eyes darting to every shadow. "Did you sleep well, ma'am?" Caleb asked, pouring with steady hands. Constance's hand trembled as she reached for her cup. "Someone was in the house last night. Someone was outside my door. I heard breathing. I heard footsteps. Perhaps it was the guards, ma'am. The guards were downstairs. This was closer." She lifted the coffee to her lips, then set it down untasted. "I found a note. On your master's desk. Did you put it there?" "No, ma'am. I was locked in my quarters all night. It was written in an educated script. How many slaves in this house can write?" The question hung poisonous in the air. Caleb met her gaze steadily. "I wouldn't know, ma'am. I'm not privy to the education of others. But you can write. Silas's father taught you. I've seen you make lists, write correspondence. Only what I need for my duties, ma'am." Louisa spoke suddenly, her voice strange and distant. "Mother, stop. Just stop. Louisa. He's going to kill us all, and we're going to let him because we're too proud to admit what we've done." Louisa's eyes were bright with something like madness. "We sold his wife. We broke families like they were dishes. We've earned this. Louisa." Constance's voice cracked like a whip. "You will not say such things. We have done nothing wrong. We are victims here. We're not victims. We're receipts. Bills coming due." Louisa stood abruptly, her chair scraping. "I'm leaving. Today. I'll go to Aunt Margaret in Charleston. I won't stay here and wait to die for sins I inherited. You'll do no such thing. This family stays together. This family is dead, Mother. Can't you see? We're just waiting for the corpses to stop moving." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Jarrett had nothing to say, his expression caught between agreement and duty. Caleb refilled Constance's cup, his face serene. "Will there be anything else, ma'am?" Constance stared at him with something beyond fear, a recognition that she'd created the instrument of her own destruction, had trained it, perfected it, and now couldn't stop it. "No," she whispered. "Nothing else." But they both knew she was wrong. There was one thing else. One final reckoning. One last rope with her name written in hempen grief. Caleb bowed and withdrew, leaving the family to fracture in the morning light. Tonight, he decided. Tonight he would finish what he'd started. Tonight, Constance Thornley would answer for Dinah's screams. And then there would be only two left, Louisa and Tobias, children paying for their parents' sins. Unless they ran. Unless they proved smarter than their elders. Unless they understood that some debts could only be paid in blood, and some bills could never be settled with anything but silence. Outside, the Alabama sun burned mercilessly and bright, indifferent to the darkness unfolding beneath its gaze. The day passed with agonizing slowness, each hour stretched taut as a hangman's rope. Constance had ordered every lamp in the house lit, as if light alone could ward off what was coming. She moved from room to room with Jarrett shadowing her, both of them jumping at every creak, every whisper of wind through the halls. Louisa had locked herself in her bedroom, refusing to emerge. Tobias clung to his mother's skirts, 12 years old, and learned that the world his parents had built was constructed on foundations of sand and blood. Sheriff Pruitt had posted 4 armed men around the property, doubled the guards, searched the quarters twice. They'd found nothing, no rope, no weapons, no evidence of conspiracy. The slaves worked in silence, eyes downcast, answering questions with carefully neutral words that revealed nothing. By sunset, the tension in Thornley House had become almost physical, a pressure in the air that made breathing difficult. Caleb served dinner in the dining room, roasted chicken, rice, greens from the garden. Simple food that Constance barely touched, pushing it around her plate while Jarrett ate mechanically, rifle propped against his chair. Tobias had fallen asleep at the table, exhausted by fear. "Take the boy upstairs," Constance ordered. "Put him in my room. He'll sleep with me tonight. Jarrett nodded to one of the guards, who lifted the sleeping child. Constance stood to follow, then paused at the doorway. She turned back to look at Caleb, really look at him, perhaps for the first time seeing the man rather than the servant. I remember when you came here, she said softly. You were young. 24. Silas's father bought you from an estate sale in Mobile. You could read, write, do figures. You were considered quite valuable. Yes, ma'am. And we put you to work serving. Keep you close. Trusted you with our most intimate moments. Her voice cracked slightly. Was it all a lie? All these years? Caleb could have maintained the pretense. Could have played the loyal slave one more time. But he was tired, so tired, of wearing the mask. No, ma'am. It wasn't a lie. I served faithfully because that was my only choice. But faithfulness extracted by force isn't loyalty. It's just survival. And Dinah? When we sold her. You didn't sell her, ma'am. You suggested it. You stood in the dining room while your husband decided my wife's fate, and you said, perhaps it would teach him proper fear. Those were your exact words. I remember them the way you remember scripture. Constance's face went pale. I was angry. The china was irreplaceable. And my wife was replaceable. Is that what you're saying? Caleb's voice remained soft, conversational, but underneath it ran a current of rage so deep it had carved canyons in his soul. You took my heart and called it inventory. You broke me and called it management. And now you want absolution. I want the truth. Are you killing my family? The silence stretched between them, filled with 23 years of unspoken violence. Yes, Caleb said simply. I am. Constance swayed, one hand gripping the doorframe. Jarrett's hand flew to his pistol, but Constance stopped him with a gesture. Why tell me now? Because I want you to know. I want you to lie awake tonight understanding exactly what's coming. I want you to feel what Dinah felt, helpless, condemned, awaiting judgment from people who have absolute power over your life. Caleb stepped closer, and Constance flinched. You sold my wife to the devil himself. You took my heart and called it commerce. Tonight, I'm taking yours. Guards. Constance's scream shattered the moment. Arrest him. Lock him up. 4 armed men rushed into the dining room, rifles raised. Jarrett leveled his pistol at Caleb's head. Don't move, the overseer growled. Don't you even breathe wrong. Caleb stood perfectly still, hands at his sides, face serene. He'd known this moment was coming. I had planned for it. Lock him in the cellar, Constance ordered, her voice shrill with hysteria and relief. Chain him to the wall. I want him unable to move, unable to. Ma'am, one of the guards interrupted nervously. Begging your pardon, but did he actually confess? I mean, if we're to bring charges. He confessed to me. I heard him. But legally, ma'am, the word of a slave against. I don't care about legalities. Constance was shaking now, unraveling. He's a murderer. He killed my husband, my son, and my brother. Lock him up or I'll do it myself. They dragged Caleb to the cellar, iron manacles biting into his wrists. Chained him to the stone wall in the dampness and dark, where disobedient slaves had been chained for generations. Where the walls still bore scratches from fingernails, prayers from lips, the evidence of suffering too deep for words. Jarrett stood in the doorway, triumphant. You should have kept that mask on, boy. Should have kept playing your part. Now you'll hang legal-like, and everyone will watch. Perhaps, Caleb said. Or perhaps I've already finished what I started. The word sent a chill through Jarrett, but he said nothing more. Just locked the cellar door and stationed 2 guards outside. Upstairs, Constance barricaded herself in her bedroom with Tobias. Posted guards outside her door, 3 of them, armed and alert. Locked the windows. Checked every shadow. She was safe. Finally, impossibly safe. The monster was chained. The nightmare was over. She almost believed it. Midnight came with a silence so complete it felt apocalyptic. Constance lay in bed beside sleeping Tobias, staring at the ceiling, listening to her own heartbeat. The guards were right outside. Caleb was chained 2 floors below. Jarrett was patrolling the house. She was protected, defended, safe. So why couldn't she stop shaking? A sound made her bolt upright, soft scratching at the door. Like fingernails on wood. Like something trying to get in. Who's there? Her voice was barely a whisper. No answer. Just scratching, patient and persistent. Guards. She called louder. Do you hear that? No response. Constance climbed out of bed, careful not to wake Tobias. Crept to the door and pressed her ear against it. The scratching had stopped, but now she heard something worse, breathing. Slow, deliberate breathing on the other side of the door. I said, who's there? Still nothing. She grabbed the fireplace poker, heavy iron, cold in her shaking hands, and unlocked the door. Threw it open, ready to strike. The hallway was empty. All 3 guards lay on the floor, throats cut, blood pooling beneath them in the lamplight. Their rifles lay beside them, unfired. They died silently, efficiently, without time to cry out. Constance's scream died in her throat. A shadow detached itself from the darkness at the end of the hall. A figure she recognized instantly, impossibly. Caleb. How, she managed. You're chained. You're locked in the cellar. I was. Until someone let me out. He moved forward, rope in his hands. You forgot, ma'am. I'm not the only one with grievances. Not the only one who remembers cruelty. The guards you trusted? One of them had a brother sold south last year. Easy to bribe him with promises of freedom. Easy to make allies when you've made so many enemies. Constance backed into her bedroom. Tobias. Please. He's just a child. A child who'll inherit this plantation. Who'll inherit your sins along with your wealth. Who'll grow up to own people and call it civilization. Caleb's face was terrible in the lamplight, no longer the neutral mask of servitude, but something ancient and implacable. But I'm not a monster, Mrs. Thornley. The boy lives. He'll carry the story forward, tell people what happens when you build empires on broken backs. Then let me go. Let me leave with him. We'll go north, You'll answer for what you've done. You'll pay the price you set when you sold my wife. Caleb was close now, close enough that she could see the rope burns on his hands, the scars on his neck, the accumulated suffering of decades made flesh. Dinah screamed when they took her. One scream, torn from her soul. Now it's your turn. Constance lunged at him with the poker. She was 52 but strong, strengthened by fear and desperation. The iron crashed against his shoulder and he grunted, but didn't fall. She swung again. This time he caught the poker, twisted it from her hands, threw it clattering across the floor. Then the rope was around her neck. She fought. God, how she fought. Clawed at his face, at his hands. Draw blood. Kicked and thrashed and screamed, but the rope pulled tighter, cutting off her air, cutting off her voice. In her last moments of consciousness, Caleb dragged her to the hallway. To the grand ballway with its crystal chandelier, the same chandelier where Silas had died, still bearing the marks of that first rope. He hauled her up the stairs to the second-floor landing, secured the rope to the banister, and pushed her over. Constance Thornley fell 6 feet and stopped, suspended above the grand ballway's marble floor. Her body swayed gently, visible from every angle, from the front entrance, from the top of the stairs, from the parlor doorway. A spectacle. A statement. A body displayed like the bodies of slaves had been displayed after failed rebellions, warning and evidence and grim satisfaction all at once. Caleb stood at the top of the stairs, breathing hard, looking down at his work. 4 deaths in 8 days. 4 lives taken to balance 1 life stolen. But the weight in his chest hadn't lifted. The rage hadn't abated. Dinah was still gone, still suffering somewhere beyond his reach, and he was still a murderer, no better than the people he'd killed, just another link in the chain of violence that defined this cursed nation. Behind him, a small voice said, "Is she dead?" Tobias stood in the bedroom doorway, eyes wide, face eerily calm. He'd watched it all. Seen everything. "Yes," Caleb said. "Are you going to kill me too?" "No. You'll live. Someone has to remember." Someone has to tell this story. Tobias looked at his mother's swaying body, then back at Caleb. Will you find your wife? The question, so simple, so innocent, nearly broke him. I don't know. I hope you do. I hope she's alive. Tobias's voice was strange, distant, aged beyond his years. I hope you find her and she forgives you for what you did to find her. Caleb had no answer to that. Downstairs, voices, Jarrett returning, finding the dead guards, shouting for reinforcements. In minutes, the house would swarm with armed men. In hours, dogs would be tracking through the Alabama night. But Caleb had planned for this too. Run, he told Tobias. Out the servants' passage. Down to the kitchen. Tell them you hid when the monster came. Tell them anything. Just run. Tobias ran. And Caleb descended the main stairs, past Constance's body, toward the front door. Toward whatever freedom looked like for a slave who'd murdered his masters. Toward the darkness that had always been his inheritance, his birthright, his only home. Behind him, Thornley House began to burn. He'd set the fires before coming for Constance, small ones, carefully placed, given time to grow. Now they bloomed through the house like deadly flowers, consuming wood and fabric and the accumulated wealth of generations. Let it burn. Let it all burn. He ran into the August night, toward the tree line, toward the swamp where dogs couldn't track, toward something that might be freedom or might just be a different kind of prison. Behind him, screams. Jarrett's voice roaring orders. Gunshots fired at shadows. And above it all, the sound of Thornley House collapsing into itself, taking its sins down to ash and memory. 3 hours later, Jarrett Holcomb stood in the quarters with a smoking pistol and blood on his hands. He'd killed 2 field slaves at random, just shot them dead in front of their families. To make his point, someone would pay for this night. Someone always paid. The quarters were silent now, 59 remaining slaves huddled in their cabins, waiting for dawn, waiting for violence, waiting for the master's justice that was never justice at all. Pearl stood in the doorway of her mother's cabin, watching Jarrett rage. Her face was calm, peaceful almost. Because she'd seen Caleb run. Had watched him disappear into the tree line like smoke, like a ghost, like a promise kept. And she knew, they all knew, that he'd gotten away. The invisible man had struck back and vanished, leaving only bodies and questions and the terrible understanding that the enslaved were not, would never be, could never be the docile property their masters imagined. Somewhere in the Alabama darkness, Caleb ran. Ran toward freedom or death or something in between. And in his wake, Thornley Plantation burned like the hell it had always been. Before we continue, hit that subscribe button if you crave more macabre tales. Comment your thoughts. How far would you go for freedom? 2 weeks had passed since the night Thornley House burned. The mansion still stood, partially. The east wing had collapsed entirely, taking the guest rooms and Montgomery's study with it. The grand ballway remained, though blackened and skeletal, the chandelier that had held so many bodies now twisted metal on scorched marble. The quarters were empty, their inhabitants sold at auction 3 days after the fire. Jarrett had made sure of that, parceling out 59 souls to different plantations across 3 counties, ensuring no 2 family members went to the same place. Punishment. Collective and absolute. Tobias and Louisa Thornley had fled to Mobile the morning after, escorted by Sheriff Pruitt himself. They would live with their Aunt Margaret, orphans of a cursed bloodline, carrying secrets that would wake them screaming for years to come. The plantation was being sold. No one wanted it, the land was tainted now, the story too dark, the reputation too damaged. But someone would buy it eventually. Someone always did. The machinery of slavery ground forward regardless of individual tragedies, converting suffering into profit with mechanical efficiency. Jarrett had stayed on to supervise the sale, living in the overseer's cottage, drinking himself through each night, jumping at shadows. He'd aged 10 years in 2 weeks, his face gaunt, his small eyes haunted. He slept with his pistol loaded and his door barricaded, but sleep came rarely and never easily. The hunt for Caleb had lasted 5 days. Dogs tracked him to the swamp and lost the scent. Patrols found nothing. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed him, opened up and taken him down into darkness. Dead or escaped, no one knew. Either way, he was gone. And that not knowing was worse than any corpse. On the 16th day, a traveling preacher arrived at Thornley Plantation. His name was Reverend Hosea Blackwood, and he specialized in cleansing cursed properties. He was a tall, thin man in his 60s, with pale eyes that seemed to look through surfaces into the rot underneath. He'd been summoned by the potential buyers, a family from Atlanta who wanted assurances that the property's dark history wouldn't follow them home. Jarrett met him at the ruined entrance, flask already in hand though it was only noon. "You here to pray away ghosts, preacher?" Jarrett's laugh was bitter. "Good luck. This place has enough sin soaked into it to damn the righteous." "I'm here to bear witness," Reverend Blackwood replied calmly. "To acknowledge what happened and offer what blessing I can. Sometimes that's all we can do, acknowledge the darkness and light a candle against it. Candles won't help. Nothing will help." But Jarrett stepped aside, letting the preacher enter. They walked through the destruction together, past the scorched dining room where Constance had served her last meal, past the blackened stairs where her body had hung, past Montgomery's ruined study and Silas's gutted bedroom. Each room held its horror, its ghost, its accusation. Reverend Blackwood said nothing, just observed, his lips moving in silent prayer or contemplation. In the grand ballway, he stopped. Looked up at the twisted chandelier, at the rope marks still visible on the banister despite the fire. "4 people died here," he said quietly. "No, more than 4. Many more. The ones who died slow deaths over decades. The ones whose names nobody remembered. This isn't just a crime scene, Mr. Holcomb. It's a graveyard." "It was the valet," Jarrett said, his voice slurred. "Trusted house slave. Killed them all because we sold his wife. As if that gave him the right. Did it?" The question hung in the smoky air. Jarrett's face flushed red. What kind of preacher asks that? Murder is murder, no matter the reason. Is it? Reverend Blackwood turned to face him. The Bible is full of slaves rising against masters. Moses himself killed an Egyptian overseer. Sometimes God's justice looks like violence to those who benefited from the violence that came before. You're defending him. Defending that murderer. I'm acknowledging complexity. This Caleb, he committed terrible acts. Took lives. Sinned grievously. But he didn't create this situation. Slavery did. The people who built their wealth on human suffering did. He was just the bill collector. The preacher's pale eyes were merciless. Tell me, Mr. Holcomb, how many slaves have you whipped? How many families have you separated? How much suffering have you administered in the name of order? Jarrett's hand went to his pistol, but he didn't draw. Just stood there shaking, caught between rage and something that might have been shame. I did my job, he finally muttered. I kept order. So did Caleb. He just had different employers. Reverend Blackwood moved toward the servants' passage. I'd like to see the rest of the house. Alone, if you don't mind. Jarrett let him go, too drunk and too tired to argue. In the attic, among trunks of moth-eaten clothes and broken furniture, Reverend Blackwood found what he'd somehow known he would find. A hidden space. Barely visible, tucked behind a false wall that had survived the fire through sheer luck or providence. Inside, a small collection of items that told a story more eloquently than any confession. A worn Bible, its margins filled with tiny, meticulous handwriting. Commentary and questions and arguments with Scripture, the work of a mind that had been educated just enough to be dangerous. A bundle of letters, never sent, addressed to Dinah. 23 years' worth of words written in the darkness, declaring love and recording cruelty, documenting the daily violence of slavery for an audience that would never read them. And a journal. Leather-bound pages covered in that same careful script. Reverend Blackwood sat on a dusty trunk and read. The journal was comprehensive, meticulous, and devastating. Caleb had recorded everything, every act of cruelty, every family separation, every punishment, every horror inflicted by the Thornley family over 23 years. Names, dates, specifics. A ledger of suffering to match the plantation's ledger of profits. But it wasn't just a record. It was a reckoning. The entries grew darker as they progressed, charting Caleb's descent from faithful servant to something else, something shaped by grief and rage into an instrument of justice or vengeance, depending on your perspective. The final entry was dated the night before Silas's death. Tomorrow, I begin. Not for justice, I'm not naive enough to believe this is justice. Not for revenge alone, though God knows the hunger for it burns in my chest like hellfire. I do this because someone must. Because if we accept our bondage with perfect silence, if we never strike back, never make them pay, never show them that we're human enough to hate and plan and execute judgment, then we've accepted the lie that we deserve this. That we're less than human. That we're property. I do this for Dinah, who screamed once and then went silent. I do this for every slave who swallowed their rage and died with it still burning in their belly. I do this because the world they've made gives me no other way to be human. Tomorrow, Silas Thornley will hang. And I will either be caught or I will continue. Either way, I'll have struck back. I'll have proven that we're not docile. Not broken. Not willing. Freedom was never meant to be given. Some of us take it in the only currency they understand. If anyone reads this, if I'm caught, if they find this journal, know that I regret nothing. Every rope. Every death. Every moment of their terror. I regret nothing except that I couldn't save Dinah before I became this thing, this monster they made me. God forgive me. Or don't. I stopped believing in forgiveness the day they put her on that wagon. Reverend Blackwood closed the journal, his hands trembling. He should burn it. Should destroy this evidence, this confession, this dangerous document that justified the unjustifiable. But he didn't. Instead, he tucked the journal inside his coat and descended from the attic. Found Jarrett passed out drunk in the overseer's cottage. Left without waking him. That night, alone in his room at the Jefferson County boarding house, he read the journal again. Every word. Every name. Every recorded atrocity. Then he burned it. Watched the pages curl and blacken, watched 23 years of suffering turn to ash. Not to hide the truth, but because the truth was too dangerous. A literate slave who'd plotted methodical murder. The very existence of such a document would lead to crackdowns, to new laws banning slave literacy, to reprisals against anyone who'd helped Caleb or known what he planned. The journal would cause more suffering than it could ever prevent. But Reverend Blackwood didn't burn the letters to Dinah. Those, he kept. Tucked them away in his traveling bag, determined to find the woman if she still lived. To deliver Caleb's words to her, even if he couldn't deliver the man himself. It was a small mercy in a merciless world, but it was something. 60 miles north, in a small cabin at the edge of the Tennessee border, a man who no longer called himself Caleb sat by a dying fire. He'd made it. Through swamps and forests, through nights of pursuit and days of hiding, through territory so hostile that every white face might mean capture and death. He'd made it to the thin edge of something that might be freedom, though freedom felt hollow when measured against what he'd lost. The cabin belonged to a Quaker family, part of a network that helped runaways, though they'd been hesitant when they'd realized what kind of runaway he was. News of the Thornley massacre had spread fast, growing with each retelling into legend, the murderous slave who'd killed an entire family, who'd burned the plantation, who'd vanished like smoke. Some said he'd had accomplices. Some said he'd been possessed by demons. Some said he was dead, killed by dogs in the swamp, his body hidden by sympathetic slaves. None knew the truth, that he was just a man, broken and remade, sitting alone in a cabin and wondering if damnation looked different from the outside than it felt from the inside. He'd killed 5 people. For who'd wronged him directly, and dozens more indirectly, the slaves Jarrett had murdered in reprisal, the families torn apart when the quarters were sold off. Blood on his hands that could never be washed clean. Has it been worth it? He didn't know. Couldn't know. The question was too large, too heavy, too stained with moral complexity to answer cleanly. A knock at the door made him reach for the knife he kept close. But it was just Samuel, the Quaker who owned the cabin, carrying news. Word from a conductor down south, Samuel said quietly, using the code language of the underground network. A woman matching your wife's description was spotted at an auction in Charleston 3 weeks ago. Bought by a rice plantation owner named Thaddeus Grayson. Place called Mercy Point, about 80 miles from the coast. Caleb's heart, which he'd thought had gone cold and dead, stuttered once in his chest. She's alive? Maybe. The description's not certain, dark-skinned woman, early 40s, scarring on her hands consistent with field work. Could be her. Could be someone else. We can try to make contact, but it'll take time. Months, maybe. Months. After everything, after all the death and fire and flight, he'd have to wait months more. Have to survive on hope and patience when he'd exhausted both. But Dinah might be alive. Might be waiting, might be enduring, might be holding on. And if she was alive, then maybe, there was some redemption possible. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but something to balance against the weight of what he'd done. Make contact, Caleb said. Whatever it takes. Please. Samuel nodded and left him alone with the fire and his thoughts. Outside, winter was coming early. The Tennessee hills had already started their transformation, leaves turning gold and red, the air sharp with the promise of cold. In a few weeks, snow would fall, covering the world in white, making everything clean and new and deceptive. But Caleb knew the truth. Knew that snow melted, that stains remained, that some things could never be made clean no matter how much time passed or distance accumulated. He'd murdered 5 people in the name of love and justice and rage. He'd burned a house and destroyed lives and set in motion suffering that rippled outward like stones in water. He'd done terrible things. He'd also done the only thing he could, given the world he'd been born into. Given chains and cruelty and the systematic destruction of his humanity. He'd struck back. And now he'd live with it, or die with it, or find some third option that looked like neither redemption nor damnation but simple, complicated existence. He stared into the flames and thought of Dinah's face. Tried to remember her smile, her laugh, the way she'd said his name when they were alone and safe and briefly happy. Tried to imagine what he'd say to her when, if, they met again. I killed for you. I burned the world for you. I became the monster they always said I was, just to prove I was human. Was it worth it? I don't know. Ask me again when I find you. Ask me again when we're both free, or both dead, or both whatever comes after you've survived the unsurvivable. The fire crackled. The night pressed close. And somewhere far to the south, in a rice field in South Carolina, a woman named Dinah bent her back to work and wondered if the man she'd loved had survived or if love itself had any meaning in a world built on bondage. The wind carried no answers. Just the promise of winter, and change, and the long, patient work of endurance. 5 years later, a story began to circulate through the networks of escaped slaves and abolitionists, the tale of the Thornley midnight slaughter, of a valet who'd methodically hanged his masters and vanished into legend. Some versions made him a hero. Some made him a villain. Some made him a cautionary tale about the dangers of educating slaves, of allowing them proximity to power, of forgetting they were human beings with memories and grief and the capacity for terrible justice. But in the quarters, in the secret meetings, in the coded songs and whispered stories, Caleb became something else, proof that resistance was possible. That slaves weren't docile. That the system could be fought, even if fighting it meant becoming the very violence it had taught you. The story grew, changed, adapted. Sometimes Caleb escaped to Canada and started a new life. Sometimes he died in the swamps, free at least in death. Sometimes he found Dinah and they lived out their days in quiet defiance of the world that had tried to break them. No one knew the truth. No one could. But the story itself was enough. The story was a weapon, sharp and dangerous, passing from mouth to ear in the darkness, reminding the enslaved that they were not powerless. Not completely. Not as long as they could remember, and plan, and strike back when the moment came. And in Thornley, Alabama, the burned plantation remained empty for decades. Locals avoided it, claiming it was haunted. Said you could hear voices in the ruins, screaming, or singing, depending on who you were and what you'd done. The land eventually sold to new owners who built new structures, but the stories persisted. The ground remembered what had happened there, and the memory seeped up through the soil like groundwater, poisoning everything it touched. Some debts, it turned out, couldn't be paid. Some bills came due long after the original creditors were dead. Some hauntings were spiritual, and some were simply historical, the past refusing to stay buried, demanding acknowledgement, demanding justice, demanding that someone, somewhere, remember. Thornley House was gone. But what it represented, the horror and the resistance, the cruelty and the reckoning, that remained. And would remain, long after everyone involved had turned to dust, until the day the entire system that had created both the plantation and its destruction finally collapsed under the weight of its own evil. That day was coming. Slower than justice demanded, but inevitable as death. The ropes were already being braided. The nooses were already being tied. And all across the South, in quarters and cabins and secret spaces, people were learning patience, learning planning, learning that freedom was never meant to be given. Some of them would take it in the only currency the masters understood. If this story chills you to the bone, subscribe for more horror that haunts. Tell us in the comments, what's the most terrifying historical event you'd want us to cover next?